From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
We reject the president-elect! We reject the president-elect!
Tens of thousands of people from Oakland to Boston have taken to the streets to protest the election of Donald Trump. We'll air voices from the streets and speak with The Intercept's Glenn Greenwald on Democrats, Trump, and the ongoing dangerous refusal to learn the lesson of Brexit. Then, as thousands gather in Morocco for the UN Climate Summit, we'll speak with Bill McKibben of 350.org about what it'll mean to have a climate change denier in the Oval Office.
July and August were the two hottest months we've ever measured on this planet, and in fact, the scientists who look at the proxy records from before we had thermometers tell us that July and August were probably the two hottest months in the history of human civilization. Against that backdrop, to see a buffoon like Trump, playing games with climate change is sobering.
Donald Trump has called climate change a Chinese hoax and has vowed to approve the Keystone XL pipeline. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Tens of thousands of people took to the streets across the United States Wednesday to protest the election of Donald Trump, who surged to victory over Hillary Clinton in Tuesday's presidential election. In California, at least 13 people were arrested as hundreds blocked traffic on both the 101 and the 110 freeways. Thousands more gathered at Los Angeles City Hall, where some burned a giant effigy of Donald Trump. In nearby Santa Ana, California, police fired rubber bullets and pepper spray at hundreds of protesters after the crowds took over major intersections. In Oakland, California, police also deployed tear gas and flashbang grenades against crowds of thousands who blocked traffic with their bodies and by lighting fires and burning Trump piñatas. In Seattle, thousands took to the streets for a protest called by the Socialist Seattle City Council member Kshama Sawant, while in Chicago, thousands rallied outside Trump Tower, where at least 5 people were arrested. Protests were also held in Portland, Oregon, in Miami, Florida, New Orleans, Louisiana, Richmond, Virginia, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Austin, Texas, and outside the White House in Washington, D.C. In the Northeast, at least 4,000 people descended on the Boston Commons. More than 1,000 rallied outside Philadelphia City Hall, and as many as 10,000 people surged through New York City streets and surrounded the barricaded-off Trump Tower, where Donald Trump lives. The crowd shouted, "Not my president," while workers in uniform cheered on the marchers. At least 65 people were arrested. This is one of the protesters in New York City.
I think it speaks to the disenfranchisement of the people that someone like him could be seen as offering anything to the masses. I mean, I think Hillary's no savior either. I think she has an imperialist track record. I think she's a very dangerous candidate, but I think Donald Trump's ability to mobilize perhaps Latin racist thoughts is incredibly terrifying, and it's urgent to be out here today.
Crowds also gathered for anti-Trump protests in Britain and the Philippines. Students across the country also staged walkouts Wednesday to protest Donald Trump's election. In California, thousands of students poured out of high schools across the Bay Area. Hundreds of high school and college students also walked out of classes in Seattle, Phoenix, New York City, Portland, Oregon, Boulder, Colorado, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and on the campuses of the University of Connecticut and the University of Texas. The protests come as Donald Trump heads to the White House today to meet with President Obama in the Oval Office. On Wednesday morning, Democratic presidential candidate Hillary Clinton gave a concession speech at the New Yorker Hotel's Grand Ballroom in New York City, during which she called her defeat painful but urged a peaceful transition of power.
I know how disappointed you feel because I feel it too. And so do tens of millions of Americans who invested their hopes and dreams in this effort. This is painful, and it will be for a long time. But I want you to remember this. Our campaign was never about one person or even one election. Donald Trump is going to be our president. We owe him an open mind and the chance to lead. Our constitutional democracy enshrines the peaceful transfer of power.
Analyses of exit polls from Tuesday's presidential election shows voters nationwide were dramatically split by race. People of color voted overwhelmingly for Hillary Clinton, including 88% of all African-American voters. 58% of all white voters, in contrast, voted for Donald Trump. Support for Trump was more pronounced among the white male voters, 63% of whom supported him. But white female voters also supported Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton by a 10-point margin, with 53% supporting Trump and only 43% supporting Hillary Clinton. This is Kenyan-American activist and writer Agunda Kio speaking during a demonstration Wednesday outside Trump International Hotel in New York City.
I want to say something specific to my white women allies. 53% of the people who voted for Donald Trump were white women. How did that happen? How did that happen? We need to come together as a multiracial group of people who recognize that white supremacy is the greatest disease in this country. All right?
Exit polls show voters were also divided by age, with the majority of all voters age 18 to 44 voting for Hillary Clinton and the majority of voters 45 and older voting for Donald Trump. As Donald Trump heads to the White House, Trump's aides say he's also beginning to assemble his cabinet. New Jersey Governor Chris Christie is the head of Trump's transition team. The New York Times is reporting that likely cabinet members include former New York Mayor Rudolph Giuliani, Alabama Senator Jeff Sessions, former House Speaker Newt Gingrich, and businessman Steven Mnuchin, who formerly worked for Goldman Sachs. Trump's aides say he's also preparing to nominate a Supreme Court justice. In financial news, global markets have rebounded after plummeting upon the news of Trump's victory. Stocks of Sun companies surged, including the largest private prison contractor, Corrections Corporation of America, CCA, which recently changed its name to Core Civic and is up 43% since Trump's victory. Geo Group, another private prison contractor, is up 21%. The Intercept reports stocks also surged for many military contractors, including Raytheon, General Dynamics, Lockheed Martin, and Boeing. In more results from Tuesday's election, Democrat Maggie Hassan has beat out Republican Kelly Ayotte in the New Hampshire Senate race, one of the tightest and most closely watched races this year. The race cost $120 million, a staggering amount for the tiny state of New Hampshire. With Hassan's victory, Democrats now have 48 senators to the Republicans' 51. Louisiana's Senate race has not yet been decided. Meanwhile, in Maine, voters approved a ballot measure that will transform the way voting occurs in the state and will open the door for more third-party candidates. The measure approves ranked choice voting, which means people can vote for their choice of candidates in order. If their first-choice candidate doesn't win, their vote automatically defaults to their second-choice candidate, and so on. Maine becomes the first state in the nation to approve the style of voting, which will be used for both state and federal elections. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights is reporting a U.S.-led airstrike about 25 miles north of Raqqa has killed at least 20 civilians and injured at least 32 more. This comes as U.S. Central Command says 119 civilians have been killed since 2014 in U.S. airstrikes in Iraq and Syria. In more news from Iraq, Amnesty International is calling on the Iraqi government to investigate the execution and torture of civilians by the U.S.-backed Iraqi government forces near Mosul. This comes after an Amnesty investigation found evidence the Iraqi government forces had killed at least 6 villagers near Mosul execution style. Amnesty has also accused militia members of engaging in torture, tying suspected civilians to cars and driving them through villages, beating people's faces with cables and holding them inside poultry cages in public. In Afghanistan, the United Nations has launched an investigation into a series of U.S. airstrikes that killed more than 30 civilians near the city of Kunduz 1 week ago. The UN assistance mission in Afghanistan says the majority of the victims were women and children. And in North Dakota, a pipeline safety expert hired by the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe has concluded the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers environmental assessment of the $3.8 billion Dakota Access Pipeline was seriously deficient and had underestimated the possibility of pipeline spill into the Missouri River. Specialist Richard Kuprowitz concluded the pipeline should be rerouted away from an area that's prone to landslides. President Obama has indicated the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is considering a plan to reroute the pipeline, and the U.S. Army Corps continues to withhold a permit necessary for the company to drill underneath the Missouri. But Energy Transfer Partners, the company behind the Dakota Access Pipeline, says it's currently mobilizing equipment to drill beneath Lake Wahe on the Missouri River, even though the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has not yet granted the permit required to do so. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org. This is War, Peace, and the Presidency. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. Not my president. That was the chant at protests across the country Wednesday as tens of thousands of people took to the streets to protest the election of Donald Trump, who surged to victory over Hillary Clinton. In California, at least 13 people were arrested as hundreds blocked traffic on two major highways. Thousands more gathered at Los Angeles City Hall, waving Mexican flags and burning a giant effigy of Donald Trump. In nearby Santa Ana, police fired rubber bullets and pepper spray at hundreds of protesters after the crowds took over major intersections. In Oakland, police also deployed tear gas and flashbang grenades against crowds of thousands of protesters.
In Seattle, Washington, thousands took to the streets for a protest called by the Socialist City Council member Kshama Sawant, while in Chicago, thousands rallied outside Trump Tower, where at least 5 people were arrested. Protests were also held in Portland, Oregon, Miami, Florida, New Orleans, Louisiana, Richmond, Virginia, and Austin, Texas, Boston, and Philadelphia. Here in New York, as many as 10,000 people surged through the streets and surrounded the barricaded-off Trump Tower, where Donald Trump lives. At least 65 people were arrested. Here are some of the voices from the protest in New York.
We reject the president-elect! We reject the president-elect!
I think it speaks to the disenfranchisement of the people that someone like him could be seen as offering anything to the masses. I mean, I think Hillary's no savior either. I think she has an imperialist track record. I think she's a very dangerous candidate, but I think Donald Trump's ability to mobilize perhaps latent racist thoughts is incredibly terrifying, and it's urgent to be out here today.
Not my president!
Even though we can't really change anything and we have to accept what has happened, we want them to know that we're like this is awful. And even though we can't change anything, it feels good to stand together with my brothers, my sisters, with people that share my beliefs, and let everyone know that we are not okay with this.
He's the epitome of a system that's broken down into virtual reality where we're going on these false notions and premises and nobody knows what's real or why anymore, and it's the painful underbelly that we need to wash away.
Donald Trump, go away! Racist, sexist, anti-gay! Donald Trump, go away! Racist, sexist, anti-gay!
He is a racist, he is a sexist, he is a neo-Nazi, and he does not deserve to run our country.
People protesting outside the residence of Donald Trump at Trump Tower in New York on Wednesday night.
Well, today, President-elect Donald Trump is heading to the White House to meet with President Obama 2 days after his shocking victory. On Wednesday, Obama vowed to work with Trump to ensure a smooth handover of power.
The peaceful transition of power is one of the hallmarks of our democracy. And over the next few months, we are going to show that to the world.
Meanwhile, Trump's transition team has assembled a short list of who would make up Trump's cabinet. Former New York Mayor Rudolph Giuliani and New Jersey Governor Chris Christie are among those in consideration for Attorney General. Christie is also being considered for Homeland Security Secretary, as is Milwaukee Sheriff Dave Clark. Secretary of the Interior might go to former Alaska Governor Sarah Palin or oil executive Forrest Lucas. Former UN Ambassador John Bolton and former House Speaker Newt Gingrich are in the running for Secretary of State. Donald Trump is also expected to quickly nominate a conservative Supreme Court justice to fill the seat left vacant by the death of Antonin Scalia. To talk more about the election of Donald Trump, we're joined by the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Glenn Greenwald, one of the founding editors of The Intercept. His most recent piece, Democrats, Trump, and the ongoing dangerous refusal to learn the lesson of Brexit. Glenn, it's great to have you with us. Why don't you start off by just sharing your response to what took place this week here in the United States, the election of Donald Trump and the defeat of Hillary Clinton?
It's obviously a shocking outcome, in particular because the not just polling data, but all of the self-proclaimed experts in data journalism, this new field of journalism that has arisen that claims to only view politics through an empirical lens rather than through the dirty ideologies or partisan biases that everybody else is burdened with, assured everybody that it was overwhelmingly likely that Clinton would win. Every model had her at 85 to 90%, and yet she lost and lost pretty resoundingly, at least on the level of the Electoral College. She obviously won the popular vote, but that's not what matters. So there's a shock about the fact that all of our empirical models, all of the ways that we try and predict the future have failed. But then there's an even greater shock over the fact that somebody who stands so far outside of the norms of our political traditions and ideologies is now the president-elect of the United States, and in 2 months will be sitting behind that large desk in the Oval Office, commanding a massive military. In fact, the most powerful and destructive military ever created in human history, as well as a gigantic nuclear arsenal that can destroy the world many times over. A vast spying machine that exists both on foreign soil but also domestically. And this huge apparatus of power that has been built up by both parties over the last 15 years is now in the hands of somebody who, by pretty much all metrics, is clearly an authoritarian without much regard for the constraints of Constitution or law. And I think what we're seeing in the aftermath of this is an attempt by Democrats who nominated a candidate, Hillary Clinton, despite knowing how weak and how vulnerable and how deeply unpopular she was across many sectors in the country, who nonetheless insisted on nominating her in the face of all sorts of empirical evidence that she would not only lose, but could literally lose to anyone. That those very same people who insisted on marching behind her are now attempting to blame everyone they can find, except, of course, from themselves, for this debacle. And I think that if we're going to have any kind of constructive discussion in the aftermath of Trump's victory, it has to include, first and foremost, a discussion about why the Democratic Party has become such a small minority party, a minority in the House, a minority in the Senate, lost control of the White House to someone like Donald Trump, is obliterated on the state and local levels. What is it about the Democratic Party that has caused huge portions of the American voting population to turn their back to it and to reject it? And I think we're seeing Democrats scrambling around trying to avoid that discussion by casting the blame on everybody else. And I think that will only ensure that this kind of event will continue to replicate itself in the future.
Well, on Wednesday, Senator Bernie Sanders issued this statement on Trump's election. Donald Trump tapped into the anger of a declining middle class that is sick and tired of establishment economics, establishment politics, and the establishment media. People are tired of working longer hours for lower wages, of seeing decent-paying jobs go to China and other low-wage countries, of billionaires not paying any federal income taxes, and of not being able to afford a college education for their kids, all while the very rich become much richer. Senator Bernie Sanders, who opposed Hillary Clinton in the Democratic primary, went on to say, quote, "To the degree that Mr. Trump is serious about pursuing policies that improve the lives of working families in this country, I and other progressives are prepared to work with him. To the degree that he pursues racist, sexist, xenophobic, and anti-environment policies, we will vigorously oppose him." That's a statement from Senator Bernie Sanders. Glenn Greenwald, many have said that if Sanders had been the Democratic presidential candidate, then perhaps Trump would not have won the election.
Right. So that's a counterfactual that none of us can know for certain. What I do know for certain, and what I wrote about back in March or February, I believe, was the fact that all empirical evidence, which remember is what Democratic opinion-making elites and liberal pundits and data journalists tell us is the thing that should guide our thinking, all available empirical evidence showed that Bernie Sanders was a much more popular and a much stronger candidate than Hillary Clinton against every single Republican opponent, including Donald Trump. He was running many points ahead of Clinton on every poll in terms of who he might run against versus her, in terms of approval rating, in terms of popularity. Democrats insisted that we should ignore all of that empirical evidence, that it was unreliable, that once the general election campaign started, Republicans would depict Sanders as a communist, that he would have no chance, in contrast to Clinton, who has already been deeply vetted. We'll never know for certain whether those arguments were true or not, but what I know for certain is two things. Number one, that the empirical evidence, weak or unreliable or incomplete as it might have been, all pointed to the fact that Hillary Clinton was highly likely to lose and Bernie Sanders had a greater chance of winning. And in fact, I wrote an article back in the primary saying, with Donald Trump looming, can we really take the gamble, the huge gamble of nominating a candidate who is as weak and unpopular as Hillary Clinton, but lost that argument, lost that debate, and as a result, Hillary Clinton was the nominee and she lost to Donald Trump. The other point that I think is really worth making is that that statement from Senator Sanders is actually quite remarkable, because he isn't coming out and saying everybody who voted for Donald Trump is a racist troglodyte. He's not saying that everyone who voted for Donald Trump is a misogynist who hates women and cast their vote for that reason. He's saying that there are a huge number of people who voted for Donald Trump and not for Hillary Clinton who have very valid grievances. And those grievances are grounded in a system of policies that both political parties have played an equal role in creating. Look at what he's describing: jobs going overseas, industries being destroyed, Wall Street being protected. You can go back into the 80s, into the era of Reagan and trickle-down economics and the destruction of unions to find the genesis of it. And then you look into the 90s with NAFTA and free trade mania and the liberation of Wall Street from all kinds of constraints. And into the 2000s, when in the post-2008 economic crisis, the Obama administration prosecuted not a single Wall Street executive responsible for that crisis, while continuing to build the world's largest penal state, largely for poor people, people with no power. And it's this inequality, this oppression of huge numbers of people in the name of globalism and free trade that Bernie Sanders is describing in that statement as why Trump won. And it's the Democrats and the Republicans who played a huge part in constructing that system. And Hillary Clinton, probably above every other politician who could have run, is the symbol of safeguarding that system, of believing in it, of advocating for it, and most of all, of benefiting from it greatly. And so you sent a Democratic nominee into the general election in this climate who could not have been more ill-suited to voice the kind of systemic critique that Donald Trump, being the con artist that he is, was able to voice, and that Senator Sanders has spent his entire career trying to advocate for. And I think you see the contrast really well in terms of how Senator Sanders would have run against Trump in that statement that he just issued versus how most Democrats are reacting to this Trump victory.
And then you have the media part of this, right, where you have the unending Trump TV, not the new Trump TV, but all the networks Trump TV. When it came to Donald Trump, they showed more footage of his empty podium waiting for him to speak than they ever played of the words of Bernie Sanders. So you had the endless platform for Donald Trump, but rarely did you have Bernie Sanders showing in any way the extent of the speeches that he gave. You'd have whole speeches of Donald Trump. When it came to Bernie Sanders, that famous night, March 15th, that was, Super Tuesday 3, every single victor and loser that night, from Rubio to Kasich to Clinton to Cruz to Trump, all their speeches were played, except for Bernie Sanders, who was speaking to thousands and thousands and thousands of people that night in Arizona. This is just emblematic of the rest of the coverage. They never played a word that he said that night.
Right, and I think there's a lot to unpack there in terms of how the media functions and in terms of the media role in this election. So let's begin with the fact that Donald Trump's public persona prior to this election was consecrated and constructed by one of the most powerful media organizations in the world, if not the most powerful media organization in the world, which is NBC News, or NBC rather, which for many, many years paraded Donald Trump in the format of a reality TV program watched by tens of millions of Americans that portrayed him as the embodiment of the entrepreneurial spirit. He marched into boardrooms in charge and unflinchingly fired people who weren't working up to standard performance. He built new businesses. He was the embodiment of everything that Americans are taught to revere. And this is the person who, for decades, has been a racist, a demagogue, a con artist, and yet NBC turned him into this swaggering hero at great profit to itself. And so already he was a byproduct of media worship. And then once the campaign began, the media, as you said, nonstop fed on Donald Trump to the exclusion, certainly first and foremost of Bernie Sanders, but even to the other candidates who got far less TV time than Trump did because he was a ratings goldmine. And they would literally wait on the tarmac and excitingly and breathlessly show his plane about to land. And this built up this image in Americans' minds that Donald Trump was this all-consuming, towering new presence on the American political landscape. And the American media did a critical job in building him up during the primary and entrenching in the minds of Americans that he was not this out-of-the-norm, radical, extremist, dangerous, racist, authoritarian that he was, but instead was this new and powerful figure who was going to come and revolutionize American politics and the American political culture that so many citizens of the United States have come to despise. And I think that what you just contrasted in terms of how Trump was treated and how Sanders was treated shows a really important truth about how media operates, which is if you talk to most journalists who work at major media outlets or newspapers, as you know, and you say to them, you have all kinds of ways that you censor certain opinions, that you have of excluding certain viewpoints, they'll insist that that's not true, that they never are told what to show or not to show. They're never told what to say or not to say. And of course, that's true. And yet embedded within all of their editorial judgments about who is worth hearing from and who isn't worth hearing from are all kinds of ideological and partisan biases. So the idea that Donald Trump, the billionaire celebrity TV star, should constantly be heard from, whereas Bernie Sanders, the old Jewish socialist from Vermont, who nobody took seriously, doesn't need to be heard from with all of his boring speeches about college debt and health care and the like. In that choice is a very strong and pedantic ideological choice that the American media embraced and played a huge role in enabling Trump to march to the primary. Now, the only other point I want to add to this media issue is that I do think that media behavior changed fundamentally with regard to Donald Trump once he became the nominee. So you have the primary period where they treated him like a normal candidate. They revered him. They gave him endless free TV time. But once he became the nominee, and they took seriously the prospect that he might be president, and they started to realize and internalize the responsibility they bore for enabling him to get that far, I think they went all the way to the other extreme, where they completely united in this kind of mission of destroying Donald Trump, of preventing his victory, and ensuring that Hillary Clinton was elected. And in a big way, that also played a role, unwittingly, I think, in helping Trump, because of all the institutions in the United States, the institutions of authority that are hated, the American media leads the way. And so when people saw the media basically trying to coerce them or dictate to them that they should turn their backs on Donald Trump, that they should vote for Hillary Clinton, I think a backlash ensued where people believed that the media was being unfair and were not going to take marching orders from these media institutions that they also have come to regard as fundamentally corrupt. And unwittingly, I think that played an important role as well in ensuring that he could win.
Well, there's the leaked Clinton campaign memo to the Democratic National Committee from last year regarding Donald Trump and Ted Cruz and Ben Carson. The memo said, quote, "We need to be elevating the Pied Piper candidates so that they are the leaders of the pack and tell the press to take them seriously." Glenn Greenwald, your response to that.
There are a lot of fascinating insights in those Clinton emails. I know Democratic partisans are furious that they ever saw the light of day, and they're furious precisely because they contain a lot of really important and interesting insights about how political operatives manipulate the media, about how the media aids certain factions and tries to work against others, about how campaign operatives within the Democratic Party manipulate public opinion. And one of the more interesting aspects is exactly that, the fact that the Clinton campaign did view certain Republican candidates like Marco Rubio and Jeb Bush as being serious threats to them and to Hillary Clinton's election, and in what they thought was a very clever maneuver, wanted to elevate the candidates that they thought were less threatening, such as Donald Trump, to the top of the pack. And in a lot of ways, they have reaped what they have sown, because Donald Trump did end up essentially becoming the nominee because of the media's treatment of him. And in retrospect, he probably was one of the more threatening candidates, because the Clintons know how to defeat conventional orthodox Republican candidates like Jeb Bush or Marco Rubio. They can do that in their sleep. Donald Trump was a very unconventional candidate. I think he animated parts of the voting population who either haven't voted in the past or who haven't voted Republican to vote for him. And the strategies that the Clintons anticipated they would use, because they've always worked in the past, simply didn't work this time. And you could conclude that in some ways they sort of outsmarted themselves.
Break, then come back to this discussion. And after we finish with Glenn, we'll be joined by 350.org co-founder Bill McKibben on where the environmental movement goes here, with a president-elect who calls climate change a Chinese hoax and is calling, among other things, for permitting the Keystone XL pipeline. Glenn Greenwald is Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, one of the founding editors of The Intercept. This is Democracy Now! Back with Glenn in a minute.
To my face, call me out on my race, at war, making love to you, broken spines down the line, they say nothing's mine, it's the joke of racism, we're to my face, call me out on my race at war, making love to you.
Yes!
Burning in Birmingham, sung by Amy Leon last night at last night's We Stand Together rally in New York City to reject misogyny, racism, and embrace each other. That was the name of the rally. Special thanks to Democracy Now!'s Renee Feltz. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Our guest is Glenn Greenwald, who wrote the piece, Democrats, Trump, and the ongoing dangerous refusal to learn the lesson of Brexit.
Glenn Greenwald, in that piece, you write, quote, "The prevailing institutions of authority in the West for decades have relentlessly and with complete indifference stomped on the economic welfare and social security of hundreds of millions of people." You point also to the many analogies between Brexit, the decision by the British public to exit the European Union. So could you say a little about those analogies and how Trump fits into wider public sentiments, not just in the U.S., but also in Europe?
It's incredibly striking, but also very alarming how similar the path of Brexit was to the election of Trump, because just like with the U.S. election, in the UK during the Brexit debate referendum, British elites outside of this kind of circle of populist right-wing Murdoch types pretty much were unified across ideological and party lines. You had the liberals and the labor centrists and the sort of more establishment conservatives united in opposition to Brexit. And they essentially stayed online all day on Twitter telling each other how smart they were and praising each other's columns, saying that Brexit was this grave threat and this unique evil. And the opinion class that is considered respectable, meaning not the right-wing tabloids, essentially unified, just like the opinion-making elites in the U.S. outside of Sean Hannity and Fox News and Ann Coulter, that wing of Fox News and that right-wing circle were unified as well. You had leading neocon intellectuals and establishment Republicans and then the sort of establishment liberal pundits, all in agreement that Trump was this grave evil, constantly praising each other, inciting each other, in this endless echo feedback chamber. And so the people who were supporting Brexit and the people who were supporting Trump weren't really ever heard from. They were just talked about in very contemptuous tones. These were the troglodytes, these were the uneducated idiots, these were the people motivated by malice and racism and xenophobia. And so they were sort of looked at like zoo animals, like things that you dissect and condemn. And because this opinion-making elite was so unified, it led so many people in both cases to believe that their victory was certain. Nobody thought in the opinion-making elite classes that Brexit would win, and the same is true of Trump. And then both before and after you had this result, what you saw is not any notion of accountability. Why are there so many people wanting to leave the EU? Why are there so many people supporting this person so far outside the norm? No accountability, no self-critique. Only a way to distract attention from their own responsibility by just spouting hatred and disgust for the people who are being insubordinate. And what you have as a result are these decades of trends that we began by talking about that Senator Sanders described, in which tens of millions of people have been trampled on by these policies of Western institutions of authority who are essentially invisible and ignored. And the more you ignore them and the more you scorn them and the more you tell them that their grievances are invalid, the more they're going to be susceptible to scapegoating, the more their bigotry will be inflamed, and the more they'll want to destroy the systems and the institutions that they believe are responsible for their suffering. And so a lot of people who voted for Brexit, a lot of people who voted for Trump understand exactly all the arguments that were made about why each of them is potentially destructive and so dangerous. And they did it not despite that, but because of that, because they want to punish and ultimately destroy the institutions who no longer have any credibility with them and who they believe are responsible for the suffering and the lack of security that they experience in their lives without anyone really caring about it at all. And until we start to address that and until institutions, elite institutions, take responsibility for it, those things are going to continue to fester and grow. And it very well may be the case that Trump and Brexit are just the beginning of this very alarming cycle rather than the peak of it.
Can you talk about the names that are being now talked about as a possible Trump cabinet, like former New York Mayor Rudolph Giuliani, maybe as Attorney General or Governor Chris Christie, whose two top aides were just found guilty on all criminal counts around the Bridgegate scandal. Christie also possibly being considered for Homeland Security Secretary, as is Milwaukee Sheriff David Clark. Secretary of Interior might go to former Alaska Governor Sarah Palin or oil executive Forrest Lucas, former UN Ambassador John Bolton, and former House Speaker Newt Gingrich in the running for Secretary of State. When Ambassador Bolton was the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, he famously talked about lopping off the top 10 stories of the United Nations. Glenn Greenwald, your thoughts?
Amy, that question was some kind of form of torture that ought to be outlawed. I could barely withstand listening to that. You know, I think, honestly, my brain hasn't yet processed all of that. I think most people's brains haven't. It's still very... I remember last night I was on Twitter and someone linked to a tweet from Donald Trump, which I clicked on, and in his biography, it now just says very simply, President-elect of the United States, with his huge picture and then Donald J. Trump underneath, and it was startling. It's still very difficult to believe that Donald Trump the president-elect of the United States and will actually be president of the United States in 2 months. I don't think we've even begun to process or analyze the actual repercussions of that. And then when you go to this sort of second-order horror, it's almost like a wicked nightmare, like the worst, like Sarah Palin as the Secretary of Interior, or Rudy Giuliani, who I've long regarded as probably the most authoritarian and borderline fascist mainstream figure in American political life, to be the Attorney General in charge of the prosecutorial power and the FBI, or Chris Christie, a lifelong prosecutor, in charge of the mechanisms of Homeland Security, or John Bolton, one of the most sociopathic warmongers on the planet, in charge of anything. These are genuinely terrifying prospects. And so, no, I don't have much intelligent to say about that because I haven't really started to even accept it yet. I guess the one thing that I would say is that to the extent that one can find any kind of silver lining in the election of somebody as horrifying as Donald Trump, it is that that this sort of extremism can galvanize a unified opposition that cuts across what had been impenetrable ideological and partisan lines to create a more potent opposition than has existed for a long time in this country, and that there will be a kind of clarifying moment about core political values that we've allowed to be assaulted by the establishment wings of both parties, about the necessity of protecting those. And I'm at least hopeful that there will be a kind of backlash that will be positive to the horrors that we're about to endure, many of which are unimaginable. And on foreign policy, with Donald Trump's admiration of Vladimir Putin, Putin being one of the first, also Benjamin Netanyahu, to congratulate Donald Trump on his victory? I think foreign policy is the area where there's the biggest question mark. The fact of the matter is that the primary critique of Donald Trump throughout the course of the campaign against the foreign policy of Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama was that they have used the military too much to engage in wars that were unnecessary, costing far too much money and sacrificing far too many lives, not on occasion, he pointed out, just American citizens, but also the lives of innocent non-Americans. At the same time, he's advocating this explicit form of war criminality where he wants to reintroduce torture and carpet bombing and those sorts of things. Expand Guantanamo. And so I think it's a huge question mark to expand Guantanamo and to essentially embrace all of the components of the war on terror. So I think that it really remains to be seen. I think it probably will be the case that there'll be moments when the D.C. elite will be demanding that we intervene militarily where Hillary Clinton would have been tempted to do so and Donald Trump won't, and maybe that's on balance in a very isolated way, something that's positive. But the idea of putting into someone like this hands the military of the United States and all of its might and the spying apparatuses, I think is extremely alarming. And I guess we'll have to see how that manifests. Well, Glenn Greenwald, I want to thank you very much for being with us. Glenn Greenwald, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, one of the founding editors of The Intercept. We'll link to your piece, Democrats, Trump and the ongoing dangerous refusal to learn the lesson of Brexit, as well as your other pieces. Thanks so much for joining us from Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we'll talk about the president-elect, his positions on the environment, who he could choose in positions of power, and his own views on, for example, climate change, as he talks about it as a Chinese hoax. Stay with us.
Well, now it's been about 500 years. We keep taking what we give away. Just like what we call Indian giver. It makes you sick and gives you shiver. I wish somebody would share the news. I wish somebody would share the news. I wish somebody would share backwards and ripping the soil. Where graves are scattered and blood was boiled. When all who look can see the truth, but they just move on and keep their groove.
Indian Givers, a new song by Neil Young, and you can go to our website at democracynow.org to watch and hear the whole song. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
Delegates at the United Nations Climate Summit in Marrakesh, Morocco, are expressing panic over Tuesday's election results, saying President-elect Donald Trump may threaten the future of any international agreement to slow catastrophic climate change. Trump has said he will, quote, cancel the Paris Climate Agreement and stop all payments of U.S. tax dollars to UN global warming programs, end quote. Trump has also promised to promote coal power and fracking and says he will allow for oil and gas drilling on federal lands. He's also promised to ask TransCanada to renew its permit application for the Keystone XL pipeline. On the same day Trump was elected, the World Meteorological Organization reported that the 5 years from 2011 to 2015 were the hottest on record, with hundreds of thousands of deaths likely due to global warming from human activity. The report found human-induced climate change was directly linked to extreme events, including an East African drought and famine in 2011 that claimed over 250,000 lives, and Superstorm Sandy in the U.S. that caused $67 billion of damage in 2012.
Joining us now, Bill McKibben, co-founder of 350.org, the author of a number of books, including Earth, Making a Life on a Tough New Planet. His recent article in the New York Times headlined, Why Dakota is the New Keystone. Tonight, he'll deliver the inaugural speech of the Jonathan Schell Memorial Lecture Series on the fate of the Earth at the New School here in New York. It's great to have you with us, Bill.
As always, Amy.
Your response to the election of Donald Trump?
It's been a very strange political year for me. I don't generally engage that much in electoral politics, but, you know, Bernie asked me to introduce him the day that he announced for office, and I spent a lot of time out on the campaign trail.
Bernie asked you to introduce Bernie.
Exactly. To introduce him the day he announced. And I got to spend a lot of time with him out on the campaign trail, and it was remarkable because we were reminded of what an actual political crusader looks like, and we saw the enthusiasm with which he was met. And then he lost, and the Democratic Party elites that Glenn was describing kind of took over, and then they managed to lose to the person who is in every possible way the kind of opposite of Bernie. So it's a difficult moment for everybody. Everybody's obviously in a kind of still in a somewhat in a state of shock, but there are real lessons to be taken from it. And one of them is that people who engage with the public, people who tell stories, who understand the world in real terms, those are the people who are going to be successful, whether they're good or they're bad.
Bill, you've also said that the damage from this election will be measured in geologic time.
That's right. The Trump presidency comes at a moment when we could least afford it. It's not like we were winning the climate battle before, you know, but we were beginning to make at least a little progress. There was beginning to be the kind of ramp up of renewable and clean energy in this country and around the world. The world managed a year ago at Paris to do something anyway for the first time about climate change. Now we're going to hit not a pothole but a ditch in the road, and it's not as if, I mean, the thing to remember about climate change is it's not as if we can just pick up 4 years from now where we left off. Physics is our enemy, and it imposes a difficult time limit here. We don't have any more presidential terms to waste, so we're going to have to figure out as a nation, and maybe more importantly as a planet, how to work around Trump to one degree or another.
So let's go to Donald Trump, who appeared last year on the Hugh Hewitt show and was asked about global warming.
Do you believe that the temperature of the Earth is increasing, and what would you do if you do believe that vis-a-vis global climate change?
Well, first of all, I'm not a believer in global warming. I'm not a believer in man-made global warming. It could be warming, and it's going to start to cool at some point. And, you know, in the 1920s, people talked about global cooling. I don't know if you know that or not. They thought the Earth was cooling. Now it's global warming. And actually, we've had times where the weather wasn't working out, so they changed it to extreme weather, and they have all different names, you know, so that it fits the bill.
And in December, Donald Trump was asked a similar question by Bill O'Reilly.
Do you believe in global warming, climate change? Do you think the world's going to change for the worse because it's getting warmer?
I think that there'll be little change here. It'll go up. It'll get a little cooler. It'll get a little warmer like it always has for millions of years. It'll get cooler. It'll get warmer. It's called weather. I do believe in clean. You know, I've received, a lot of people don't know this, I've received many environmental awards, many environmental awards for the work I do. And I believe strongly in clean water and clean air. But I don't believe that what they say, I think it's a big scam for a lot of people to make a lot of money.
That's Donald Trump saying that the whole issue of climate change, a big scam for a lot of people to make a lot of money. And he tweeted, the concept of global warming was created by and for the Chinese in order to make U.S. manufacturing non-competitive. So, Bill McKibben.
Well, what is there to say?
Well, there has to be a lot to say in these next 4 years.
He's as wrong on this as he is on so many other things. In this case, unlike some of the things on which he's wrong, which are a matter of opinion, that one can, whether immigrants are good for an economy, this one is a matter of just plain hard physical fact. And so it's going to find him out. I mean, we're going to continue to see the increase in disasters that we've been dealing with already during his 4 years, and it's going to be incumbent upon the rest of us to make sure that those stories tell, that people understand what's going on and they understand the reckless disregard of our administration.
And what does it matter if you have a climate denier in the White House? How do you deal with that?
Well, it matters because every single decision that's going to be made around energy and climate should be made at this point with a very firm weather eye on global warming, and none of them will be. We're going to be in an era of unrestrained license for the fossil fuel industry, an industry that a week ago was back on its heels is now back in the saddle, and it's going to take an immense amount of movement building and organizing to slow them down.
Well, could you talk a little bit about the people who are advising Trump on climate-related issues, on the environment? There's Myron Ebell, who's running the EPA working group on Trump's transition team, and he's also, of course, a climate skeptic.
He comes from the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and he's made a career out of climate denial, and I imagine a successful career, and I imagine it'll get only more successful. What we know from investigative reporting in the last year is that there's nothing new about this. I mean, Exxon knew everything there was to know about climate change 35 years ago and helped build this web of climate denial. We'd almost begun to really bust through it in the last few years. We were even able to get President Obama, who in his first term did virtually nothing about this, to finally begin to take some steps. Now we're back to ground zero in this battle. The only thing that's still moving fast is the rate of carbon increase in the atmosphere and the temperature that it's driving. We're going to have to take those stories and turn them into powerful organizing opportunities. And we can. I mean, the most remarkable story going on any place in America right now is the one that you've been documenting from Standing Rock in the Dakotas. It's the absolute all-time story of small versus big, of ancient oppression and modern possibility, of the people who've been most oppressed on this continent. But it's a story that we couldn't get Hillary Clinton to tell in the campaign. We couldn't get her to say anything about what was going on in the Dakotas. That's, as Glenn was saying earlier, part and parcel of the reason that she lost. And so we need a new kind of, I don't know whether it's a Democratic Party or a new kind of opposition that's able to take those stories, those moments, and help people understand the actual contours of the world, not the fake contours that Donald Trump describes to some effect.
So you just came back from Standing Rock. We're talking about the $3.8 billion Dakota Access Pipeline that would take fracked oil from the Bakken oil fields through North and South Dakota, go through Iowa, then to Illinois. Just recently, President Obama said the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is considering rerouting the pipeline amidst the months of resistance from the Standing Rock Sioux tribe and members of more than 200 indigenous nations across the Americas, as well as their non-native allies. This is what he said.
My view is that there is a way for us to accommodate sacred lands of Native Americans. And I think that right now the Army Corps is examining whether there are ways to reroute this pipeline in a way.
Right.
So we're going to let it play out for several more weeks and determine whether or not this can be resolved in a way that I think is properly attentive to the traditions of the first Americans.
So that was an interview President Obama did with Now This News. We don't have much time. He said we're going to let this play out for a few weeks. That was a few weeks ago.
Yeah. Tuesday, November 15th, there will be demonstrations in more than 100 American cities at Army Corps of Engineers offices demanding that the president, on his way out, do the right thing here. Who knows whether the Corps denying a permit will stick in the new Trump administration? We don't know. All we can control for the moment is what happens in the next little while, and it's time for President Obama to do more than say, well, let this play out. It's time for him, while he's still got some power, to exercise that power. If people go to no-dapofaction.org, they can find out where those protests are taking place.
And now the Energy Transfer Partners, the company that owns the Dakota Access Pipeline, says they are poised to bore under the Missouri River. It's very unclear what this means, considering they don't yet have a permit for it. You talk about it in the New York Times, a piece you just wrote, as the Keystone XL of our time, which also Donald Trump will be pushing for, but President Obama has not stopped this yet and seems to have the power to.
He could, at least for 70 days, keep them from drilling under the Missouri River. And at the very least, that would be a powerful symbolic statement and one that people will rally around. There aren't very many Americans, even in Trump's America, who don't understand the shamefulness of how we have treated the original inhabitants of this continent. This is the kind of issue that people have to get behind. They're moral issues that define who we are.
Well, Bill McKibben, we are going to do part 2 of our conversation after the show and post it online at DemocracyNow.org. Congratulations on your address tonight at the New School.
It'll be good to be thinking of Jonathan Schell, who was one of America's greatest writers and a person whose counsel would have been useful in the Trump era.
Bill McKibben will be speaking at the New School tonight, giving the Jonathan Schell Memorial Lecture. Bill McKibben, co-founder of 350.org, among his books, Earth, Making a Life on a Tough New Planet. And we'll link to his piece in the New York Times, Why Dakota is the New Keystone. In 2014, Bill McKibben was awarded the Right Livelihood Prize, sometimes called the Alternative Nobel, for his environmental activism. That does it for our broadcast. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Laura Gottesdiener, Dina Guzder, Sam Alkoff, Robbie Karen, Hani Massoud. Special thanks to Renee Feltz, Tarina Nadura, Andre Lewis. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Thanks so much for joining us.